In this video, I'm going to take you through the factors affecting research design, which can include the process of designing your research, the methods that you use, the type of data that you collect, and they can be broadly grouped into three main factors: the practical, the ethical, and the theoretical. So we're going to go through the main practical, ethical, and theoretical considerations when designing research. And I say the main ones because there will be other factors which will play a part, but they may be more specific to the topic that you're researching or the area that you're interested in. As part of the theoretical factors, I will also be discussing the debate between interpretivism and positivism. Now, this is one of the sociological debates. However, it fits nicely in with this topic, so it makes sense to kind of bring it in here. So we'll start with the we're going to start with the practical factors, and the practical factors are the ones which which impact your ability to actually carry out the research. Are you physically able to do this research, or are there factors which will limit your research or limit the type of method that you can use or the type of data that you can collect? But it's all about the actual ability to carry out that research. And the first one we need to look at is the personal characteristics of the researchers. So this can be broken down into broadly two areas. Firstly, we'll look at the social makeup, if you like, of the researcher, their CAGs: class, age, disability, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. So a researcher will need to consider who they are and how they present themselves will impact the ability to carry out the research. For example, a male researcher, carrying out research on domestic violence victims may not be the best choice, as majority of domestic violence victims are female, and they are going to probably feel quite threatened by a male researcher, and therefore not want to take part or not be very open to answering his questions. But even male domestic violence victims maybe feel more comfortable with a female researcher, as they're less likely to feel perhaps embarrassed or that they're going to be ridiculed for admitting that they are victims of domestic violence. Additionally, things like class can have a big impact as well. If you're looking at working class underachievement in schools, most researchers are middle class and come from a very academic background, and that might put off working class parents from taking part in research, or working class students taking part in research, as they feel that perhaps they may be being judged by the researcher. So the gender, the class, the ethnicity, sexuality, etc. of the researcher, or whoever it is that is collecting data, as the person collecting the data may not be the main researcher, will play a part, and that may mean that they have to get outside people to collect the data, or that they may have to consider what research method they're using, where their participants may feel a little more at ease. The second part of personal characteristics that needs to be considered is the researcher's skills. Are they going to need specialist skills in order to carry out their research? Now, this could be as simple as, are they able to interview somebody effectively, which is a particularly specialist skill. It seems like it's one of those things that we should be able to all do, but some people are more personable than others. Some people just, in their mannerisms, put other people's backs up, and if in that situation you're not necessarily going to get the best data. But it can also be linked to the group that you're studying. as well as the method. For example, if you're going to do a study on a circus and you want to use a participant observation, you may need to have some circus skills to get in with the group. If you're going to look at a biker group or a biker gang, you might need to have to ride a motorcycle. So a researcher is really going to have to consider, do I have the necessary skills and the necessary knowledge to be able to conduct the research in the best way that I think it is? Or am I going to have to rethink this because I don't have the skills, or I don't have the access to people with the skills to be able to complete this research? The second practical factor is time. Now this again can come down to two parts. The first is linked to funding, because research funding usually comes with a time limit. It might be 6 months, it might be a year, it might be 5 years. However, whatever the funding time frame is, you're going to have to fit not just the data collection into that time frame, but also your analysis, conclusions and writing up, etc. So a researcher is going to have to consider very carefully how much time they have to complete the research when deciding on their project, when deciding on their methodology, because some methods do take much longer than others in order to collect the appropriate level of data. Secondly, you also need to think about the time in terms of limits on the time of your participants. Now this is particularly apparent when researching schools. Schools aren't in session all year round, so planning to do your research in August is pointless because there's nobody there. They also have some what we refer to as pinch points in the school year, where they perhaps would be less than inclined to have somebody come in and conduct research. Exam times, maybe the run up to Christmas, or the end of the school year when things kind of get a little bit chaotic with trips and things like that, and whole school events. So a researcher is really going to need to consider as well how they can conduct their research. Are there any time limits on the way that they conduct their research, and will that impact the research method that they use? Thirdly, we're talking about access to participants. Now this can link into time and it can link into personal characteristics as well, but slightly. But the researcher needs to really consider, can they actually get to their participants? And is their research method the right one to access those participants? For example, a closed group, whether that be a world-rejecting cult or sect, or it might be a gang, an illegal gang, could be very hard to gain access to. They're not friendly to outsiders. So the researcher is going to have to consider, how are they going to get access to these people? Is it possible that if they want to do an observation, are they going to be able to go and observe them? Or is another research method going to be more appropriate here? You also need to think about how many people you're going to need for your sample. Some groups are quite small and insular, or very secretive. So for example, if you're looking at sexual fetishes, for example, people aren't particularly open about their fetishes. It's usually something quite private that they keep secret until they feel comfortable with a partner to kind of let them know. So it can be in that situation that the people won't know who to approach in order to get your participants. So it's a big factor when looking at particularly your methodology and whether or not you need to have face-to-face or virtual, if you like, access to your participants, or is this something that you can do without actually visiting with your research participants? Fourthly, funding. And funding comes up quite a lot, and it's surprising how much power and how much influence a funding body can have on your research, because not only are they paying for it, that payment may come with caveats. and may demand that you use a certain type of data or a certain type of research method. Obviously, it's linked very closely in with time and how much time you've got to complete your research. So a funding body might say, yeah, you can have the money, but we want X, Y, and Z. And you have to shape your research around that fact, around what they want. They're paying for it, so they have to shape what they want. Which also links into our final factor, which is cost. Okay, so funding is money coming in, cost is money going out. And this can link into the methodology that you choose, because some research methods are going to be more expensive than others. It can also link in with your personal characteristics. If you are not the appropriate person to collect your data, you may need to pay somebody to do it for you. And you need to think about how much money you've got coming in, obviously, to know how much you have to spend. Now, none of these things in and of themselves are the most important. That would be an opinion situation, but all have to be taken into consideration if you are trying to physically and practically conduct your research. Next up are the ethical considerations. And the first thing we're going to talk about with ethics is the ethical guidelines that a researcher needs to follow in order to make sure that their study can go ahead. Now, all research needs to go before an ethics board prior to data collection so that it can be cleared in order to be done. That the ethics board feel that this research is as ethically sound as it can be. And when the ethical guidelines are perhaps being a little bit bent rather than broken, that it's necessary for that to occur. So the the ethical guidelines that we're going to discuss in a minute, and there are 5 of them, these are not legally binding. They are moral obligations that a researcher has to their researchers and to their participants. However, it is important that I mention here as well that a sociologist can't break the law and then use their research as an excuse for it. They still have to stay within the law, just like anybody else. So when it comes to legality, they are not exempt from the law. As far as I'm aware, no sociologist has ever gone to court and tried the "I'm a sociologist, I'm just doing research" defence, and I can't imagine they would get very far if they tried. So what are these moral guidelines that researchers need to consider and not break, but possibly may have to bend a little in order to conduct their research? The first one is informed consent. All participants taking part in the research must give informed consent prior to publication. Okay. So informed consent can be given either at the time of data collection, or it can be given after data collection. It doesn't matter which way, as long as you get it. Except, and there's always an except in one situation. You do not need informed consent if you are conducting research in a public place where there is no expectation of privacy. So for example, if you are looking at gender makeup of those who shop in Primark, for example, and you decide to stand outside Primark ticking off the numbers of men and women going in and out of the store, there's no expectation of privacy there. You might look a little bit weird, but there's no expectation of privacy going in and out of Primark. If you are asking about what they bought or how much they spent, that would be would require informed consent because there is an expectation of privacy regarding our purchases. But informed consent means that your participants know what you are doing, why you are doing it, and how the data is going to be used. Okay, so you need to make sure that your participants are clear on this before publication. Now, if you are doing covert observation, whereby you don't want your participants to know that you are collecting data on them until after the data collection, because knowledge of the study could skew the data, what you can do is something called preemptive consent. And preemptive consent is where you ask a sample similar to that in your study if they would give informed consent if they were to take part in this study. And from that, you can assume that your participants would also give informed consent. Now, you still need to ask them, and you still need to get consent, but you're less likely to engage in research where people wouldn't give consent if you ask a similar group and they kind of like, yeah, I'd say yes to that. Then you're more likely to get that from your participants as well. Because you don't want to conduct all of your research, get all your data, and then your participants turn around and go, yeah, I don't want to be involved. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of funding. So informed consent, letting your participants know what you are doing, why you are doing it, and how data will be used as part of your study. And it can be given before data collection, and it can be, or it could be given after data collection. And you don't need informed consent if you are your research is taking place in a public place where there is no expectation of privacy. The second one is protection from harm, and this applies to both participants and researchers alike. It is the responsibility of the designer of the research, if you like, to ensure that participants and the data collectors are not put in any physical or psychological harm. Now, that's not to say people don't trip over chair legs or trip over and hurt themselves. That's an accident, and that's not something that the researcher can control. However, if they are conducting research that may relive trauma or are talking about sensitive subjects, the researcher has to be aware that they may cause psychological harm. Now, a good study to show about psychological harm and how research can cause psychological harm unintentionally would again be Milgram's study of obedience. The people who were involved in that study, around 60% of them took the voltage right up to the highest possible level, and they could hear the actor, obviously they didn't know it was an actor, screaming to stop and saying it hurt and that they had chest pains and things like that. Now, this caused psychological harm for their participants because it was waking them up to the fact that they could have killed somebody because somebody else told them to. Because if you asked any of those participants prior to the study whether or not they would, they'd probably have said no. But the study proved that they could do it. And that's going to mess with your head a little bit. Okay. And in terms of protection from physical harm, you cannot put your participants in physical danger, or researchers in physical danger. So, for example, it would be unethical both psychologically and physically to put an abuse victim in the same room as their abuser. It could lead to later physical harm and probably more than likely psychological harm as well. Next up is privacy. Now, with privacy, what we're talking about here is that you don't collect data that doesn't link directly to your study. You're not going beyond the scope of your study. So you're not asking questions about things that don't have anything to do with your study. So for example, you might be looking at the mental health and well-being of single mothers, teen mothers. You start asking about their Saturday night out, or how many sexual partners they've had, and things like that, and it goes beyond the scope of the study. You are invading their privacy. In an observation, you might see things that have nothing to do with your study, and that's fine as long as that data, that doesn't influence your record of the data you are collecting. Okay. So privacy, you mustn't go beyond the scope of what you're researching. Next up, we have deception. And with deception, what we're talking about here is you're not allowed to lie to your participants, because if you lie to them, you are not getting informed consent. Now, it might be that you are required to deceive them as part of your study in order to create more accurate data. Again, we go back to Milgram's study of obedience, where he told them it was a study on learning instead of obedience. Because if he told them it was a study on obedience, he would have got one of two responses. Right answerism, where they were trying to give Milgram the data that he wanted, or those who deliberately behaved in a way that was opposite to what they thought the researcher wanted. So occasionally it's necessary to deceive your participants, but as we said, you can get informed consent post data collection. And the last one is confidentiality. Yes, I know I've used the same icon for both, but I couldn't find an icon for lying. And confidentiality refers to not sharing the personal details of your participants. So you're not naming them, you're not giving out their addresses or their telephone numbers or their emails or anything like that. When you refer to individual participants, you would do so using a number or a letter. So that way the research can't come back and bite them. There will be no negative impacts on them for taking part in the study. For example, if you were to do a study on education and you were talking to teachers about their views of senior leadership, if they were honest and maybe they were pretty scathing about their senior leadership team, the head teachers, senior teachers, etc., you don't want to name them, because that could get back to those senior teachers and those head teachers, and it could make their life a little bit difficult at work. So everything is about keeping things confidential. Now, a lot of people do get privacy and confidentiality mixed up. Please try and keep them straight. Privacy, not invading the privacy of your participants. Confidentiality, keeping everybody's identity secret. Now, as I said, with these ethical guidelines, they are guidelines, and sometimes they need to be bent rather than broken in order to obtain the best data possible. So how do we get around this? How can we bend the guidelines without breaking them? The first way is through the right to withdraw. So all participants have the right to withdraw from your study up to the point of publication. After it's published, that's too late, it's out there. But right up to the point of publication, they can say, I don't want to be involved in this, please remove my data from your analysis. And you have to do it. Okay, so if they feel that their confidentiality might get breached, or that they didn't really understand what was going on, they can withdraw from the study, and you have to withdraw their data as well. The second way is debriefing. So for example, when you are doing covert observation or covert research and you need to collect the informed consent after your data collection, you would have a debriefing with your participants to explain the what, why and hows of your research to gain that informed consent. And with protection from harm, your topic may be a sensitive topic, such as domestic abuse or sexual assault or something along those lines. So a researcher will debrief with their participants to make sure they're okay, and probably will offer advice on who they can go to for more support or counselling or things like that, charities and programs that can help them. Okay, so the debriefing side of things can overcome any necessary deception, gaining informed consent, and ensuring that your participants are not being psychologically harmed by your study. But as I say, the ethical considerations are not legally binding. They are moral obligations, but you do have to pass an ethics board before you can conduct your research, and any bending of the guidelines needs to be justified and mitigated through right to withdraw or debriefing. So we're now on the final group of considerations, and these are the theoretical considerations. And this really is concerned with the data that you're collecting and the conclusions and accuracy of your study. Will your research stand up to scrutiny? Prior to publication, research goes through a peer review process. And this is almost like the critical friend, if you like, where people who are in a similar field to you will go through your research to identify any problems that may occur or may be within your research that mean that maybe your conclusions aren't as accurate or as conclusive as you might think. So there are a number of things that we need to look at here, and we've covered some of this terminology previously. But the first factor is the reliability of your study. So what we're talking about in terms of reliability is the replication. Can your study be replicated as closely as possible by another researcher? Now, with sociology, unlike psychology and the natural sciences, we are not necessarily looking for you to get the same data. Sociologists are interested in how things change over time or between social groups, such as cadges. So they might be looking for differences in data. But what they need to do is make sure that the process used to collect the data is as reliable and replicatable as possible. Now, it might be that you have low reliability as part of your study, and that doesn't mean that your study doesn't have merit. It might be the methodology that you've used lowers the reliability. For example, observations are not particularly reliable. But if that was the best way to get the data, then that's fine. But you want to try and make it as reliable as possible. Secondly, we have validity. And validity, as we've said before, looks at two things. It looks at the accuracy of the data that is collected, and it looks at the depth of the data that is collected. And you can be highly valid in terms of accuracy, but low in terms of depth, and vice versa. But what affects the validity is what's known as the researcher effects. And there are three of them. The researcher effects are Hawthorne effect, where people change their behaviour because they know they're being watched. Social desirability, where people will change their behaviour to appear more socially acceptable. Don't like the word normal, but to appear more socially acceptable. And demand characteristics, where the participant will change their answers or their behaviour to what they think the researcher wants to see. Okay, and all of those can reduce, the accuracy of the data that is collected. Now, obviously, you are not going to be, hiccups. not going to be able to mitigate them entirely. You're dealing with human beings, and human beings lie. I read somewhere that something like 40% of what is said during a day, an average person's day, they're lying, which is a considerable amount. But in terms of accuracy, what we're also looking at is not just the truth of the data you're collecting, but are you collecting the data that you need? Are you finding the information that will help you with proving or disproving your hypothesis, that will answer your research question? Or are you just getting random stuff that really doesn't apply? Okay. In terms of depth, when we're looking at validity and depth, are you finding out why? Or are you just finding out what? Do you know why people do what they do? Do you know why, or is it just, are you just describing what is going on? So in terms of the data and the validity, the more accurate you, or the mitigations you put in, which mean that your data is more accurate, will increase your validity. If you can get detailed and in-depth data, you are increasing your validity. Okay, but just like with reliability, it is impossible to have 100% accurate data and to fully know why something happens. We're human beings, we're complex creatures, apparently. They also need to consider generalizability. So this is where we're talking about your sample and the people involved in your research. So we're moving away from data now and really looking at those who were involved. And what generalizability means is, are you able to apply your conclusions to the wider research population? Was your sample big enough that you can make a generalization for that research population? Now, there will always be exceptions. There will always be people that don't fit into that nice, neat little box that we're trying to create. And that's great because it puts a lot of differences in society. But what we're looking at here is whether or not you are able to generalize your findings, or does it just apply to that small group that were part of your study? And this also links into representativeness. And again, we're talking about your sample here. And what we mean by representativeness is whether or not your sample reflects the social makeup of your research population. So for example, if you're looking at sixth form students in Norfolk, if your sample only contains girls, it's not representative because you've not got the voice of the boys within your research. Or if you don't include any disabled students or any gay students or anything like that, if you are excluding them from your study, either intentionally or unintentionally, you lose not only representativeness but also generalizability, because by being representative you are able to then generalize your results and your findings. Okay, now the final one I'm going to go into in more depth, and this is your theoretical perspective. So here we're talking about positivism versus interpretivism. Now, as I said before, this is one of the what we call sociological debates. And what that means is that sociologists argue, as they are wont to do, and try to say that one is better than the other. That positivist approach to research is better than the interpretivist approach, and vice versa. So the sort of essay question you could get here is evaluating the view that one is better than the other, or evaluating why one is not as good as the other. But either way, you have to know both of them so that you are able to determine which one you think is best. Now, obviously, with your essay, and we will be doing another video on how to write essays, is you just need to choose one side or the other. It doesn't have to actually be your opinion. It's what you can write best about. So let's get into this debate then. So when we're talking about interpretivism versus positivism, these are the two ends of the research spectrum, if you like. And what that means is that they both have very distinct ways that they believe research should be conducted, what sort of data should be collected, what methodologies should be used, and generally how a sociologist should approach their research. And as I said, they are opposite ends of a spectrum. So that means that sociologists won't necessarily be 100% positivist or 100% interpretivist. They may be slightly more one than the other, or it's kind of like a sliding scale where depending on what they do, they may have to be more one than the other or something along those lines. Okay, so first of all, let's look at interpretivism, their approaches to research. So for interpretivists, they say that you need, in order to understand society, you need to understand the meanings behind behaviour. What Weber referred to as Verstehen, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that, I'm not German, I've never studied German, but Verstehen is the idea of symbolic empathy, walking a mile in the shoes of those that you are researching. So if you want to fully understand what somebody else is going through, you need to experience it for yourself. You can't stand back and watch. You need to be involved. Okay, because that's the key thing. Interpretivists want to know why. Why does this behavior occur? Why do people feel this way? Why does this happen? Why does that happen? And in order to understand that why, you need to involve yourself with the research group. You need to experience what they experience, which is what Verstehen refers to. Positivists, on the other hand, are more scientific. They believe that sociology is a scientific pursuit and therefore should follow the same approaches as the natural sciences. They believe that sociologists should be objective and detached from their research participants in order to take out any emotion from their data collection. It needs to be clean, it needs to be clear, but it needs to be objective. So they take a much more scientific approach and are more likely to provide you with a what of society. What is society like? What is happening, rather than the why. So that when we're talking about the preferred methods, we're talking about what do they think are the more appropriate methods for studying society. So the interpretivists, who are looking to find out the why, they want to get deep, meaningful data, they want to walk a mile in the shoes of their participants, they are more likely to go for methods such as participant observation, open questions in a questionnaire or an interview. They want to take part. Okay, so they prefer highly valid methods, both in terms of depth of data over reliability. They believe that that is a better way to understand society. The positivists go the other way. They want high validity in terms of accuracy of data and high reliability methods that can be replicated and verified. So here we're looking at closed questionnaires, structured interviews, structured observations, where multiple people can conduct the research in exactly the same way, meaning high reliability and high accuracy of data. I do apologise. And this obviously leads to specific data types. The interpretivists like qualitative data. They like deep and meaningful words, whereas the positivists prefer quantitative data because it's objective and detached and there's no emotion. The data is the data. There's very little maneuvering. I mean, I'm not saying that statistics can't be manipulated, they can, and we will talk about that later, but they believe that by using quantitative data you are removing the emotion from your data. Okay, so different sociological perspectives will prefer one over the other, and I've got this the wrong way around. So we're going to have to do a little bit of jury pokery here because I've got it the wrong way around, and it should be the other way around. So we should have, rather than re-recording it, just kind of put that there and that there. Okay, because I don't want to re-record this entire slide. So the interpretivists are preferred by the interactionists, and positivism by structural approaches such as Marxism, feminism, and functionalism. And that links into their approaches to viewing society. The structural approaches like to take a macro approach, which is looking at society as a whole, whereas the interactionists take a more micro approach and looking at how individuals shape their society. So that's kind of the two branches, and neither is necessarily winning the war in terms of which is better than the other. Both have their strengths, both have their weaknesses, and that's what we're going to look at now. So interpretivism is a good way to study research, study society, because it's detailed, in-depth data. We get to know the why behind behaviour. We're not just observing it and saying this is what's happening. We're looking at why, and we're going deep and detailed in it. Positivist systems mean that social facts can be determined. And you remember this from functionalism, where Durkheim talks about these social facts, which are external constraints or impositions upon our behaviour. And the role of a sociologist, according to Durkheim, is to uncover those external forces, those social facts, those rules which can control and impact our behaviour, what he referred to as social facts. Is also regarded as a positive of positivism, yeah, that works, is that it's objective conclusions. Nobody can say that somebody's conclusions are emotional or emotionally driven because they're based on facts. And it means that we can identify trends in behaviour, and those trends can be used to predict future behaviour, as much as humans can ever be predicted. But we can say that if this happens, then we would expect to see this happen. But as I said, they're not perfect, and that's why it's a spectrum, and most sociologists won't necessarily be at either end, but somewhere in between. Interpretivism is criticised because it's descriptive, and because it's descriptive, it's open to interpretation. 3 people could read the same diary entry and come up with 3 different interpretations of that diary entry. 4 people could observe the same room, classroom, and come up with different interpretations of what was seen, what was bad behaviour, what was not, whether the teacher was labelling or whether the teacher was not. And this makes it hard to find trends and correlations and predict future behaviour. It's it's more descriptive than explanatory, according to critics. And also, because of the qualitative nature of the data, it can take a lot longer to analyse and find any similarities between the groups or between the looking at the data that's been collected. That doesn't mean positivism is better. Positivism has its own limitations. For example, it is impossible to be completely objective. We are humans. And even if you give me 10 people the same set of data, there will be slight variations. Some will include the anomalies, some will exclude them. Some will see a strong correlation, others will see a weak correlation. And it's impossible to remove our emotions and remove our values in sociological research. And as we said, it tells us what, not necessarily why. What is happening, but not necessarily why. So again, it's more of a description than an explanation. And finally, a lot of the positivist approaches use artificial settings, meaning you're taking people out of their natural environment, you're putting them in an unnatural situation where they won't necessarily behave in the same way because it is unnatural to them. Okay. Now, as I said, the sort of question you would get would be to evaluate whether one was better than the other or if one was the most appropriate way of studying society. And we will look at essay writing in a separate video. So just to summarize then, you've got the 3 factors affecting research design: practical, ethical, and theoretical. You need to be aware of what each of those are and how they can affect research design and methodological choices that are made when designing research. This is not an exclusive list. It is not everything. There are too many factors for us to cover at A level, but understanding practical, ethical, and theoretical will help you to analyze and evaluate the studies that we will be looking at as we go through this course.